Now it's been redone and re-edited and reformatted, and it's now called How to Face Death Without Fear. That's our plan, isn't it? Isn't it? Okay, good. I got the right one. Okay, good. So it's a really helpful book. I don't know if you've got it. It's come out as paperback, and it's just extremely helpful handbook. It's got, 2/3 of it actually is these practices, and we've numbered them from 1 to 87. I happen to edit it. So there's because so many things that he recommends, it's kind of overwhelming, So the book is done in chronological order, because that's the only way to handle it, because, we're saying all these different practices to do it, but at different times is the crucial thing. So basically the first part is just the different practical things about how we die and the process itself, and the 12 links at the time of death, very practical information. Then the major part of the book is, and then chronological order, the first, what to do with the weeks and months before death, months and weeks before death. And the whole thing is framed, whole thing is addressed to helping your loved ones. I mean, obviously the information is to help us die. But, if there's a chapter on what to do after you've stopped breathing, obviously you can't read that. So we've got to address it to us as the helper to help other people die. So that of course, is the perfect training for us to know how to die, So it's what to do the weeks, months, weeks before death, what to do the days before death, what to do the hours before, what to do at the time the breathing stops, what to do when the mind leaves the breath, and what to do the days after. So it's step by step, And all the practices, I mean, they're all the typical practices, variations of all kinds of practices, and they're all in the back in order, in numerical order. And they're referred to many, many times throughout this chronology, So it's, I mean, I found myself, if one is a Buddhist, one hears all these teachings, since you first become a Buddhist, you learn about death. Buddha's straight in our face from day one. We've got to start learning about impermanence and death. Why? Well, because for the Buddha, because our mind continues. And then secondly, because of the law of karma, everything we think and do and say programs our mind, and that determines our next rebirth. It's not up to do with Buddha. There's no creator in Buddhism. There's nobody judging and rewarding and weighing up all our goods and bads and sending us to the nice place or the ugly place. There's nothing like that. So we're the boss, So we need to learn about it. So this whole book started actually, more than 10 years ago. God, maybe 20 years ago. Michel was in France. He talks about this in the preface, in his own introduction. And he said, he was teaching something else, and then one of his old students, a friend of mine, came to him and said her father had just died and she didn't know what to do. So he's kind of surprised because, she's a very old student, but this is typical for all of us. And she didn't know what to do because I think we don't like thinking about death. Even if we're good little Buddhists, we don't like thinking about death. And we've not gone through the practical process. We haven't really studied what happens at death. We haven't really studied how to help a person navigate this time, because everybody dies with fear. It's not uncommon. A friend of mine in California, like 30 years ago, told me, she was a hospice nurse, she said it's a given that most people die with fear, because we don't deal with it. We don't want to know about it. And that's, so we need to confront it. So in this teaching, he completely changed, he shifted gear, and he then proceeded to teach on using a couple of texts, and this is the bulk of the book, So there's two ways to prepare for our death. Now, first of all, before we go there, we quote Rinpoche saying this, that the reason, he said, if you want to help anybody in this life, and he's talking about your rat, the mouse, the insect, your grandma, a baby, you name it. If you want to help any sentient being in this life, when they need you most is at the time of death. And the simple logical reason for a Buddhist, because it's completely contradictory to what we think. We think, oh, that's the least time. They're nearly dead, just drug them out of their brain and wait till they die, But no, from the Buddhist point of view, the logical reason that at the time of death is the most important time to help a person is because this life is finished. This life is a result of a past life. That's all gone. Now, this crucial period, which is the weeks and months before death, but particularly at the time of death, we'll be, we've only got a couple of hours, so we'll go into this pretty quickly. It's at the time when the death process starts. It's at a very specific time, and we'll discuss it, that the karmic seeds that we ourselves have planted in our mind from our past actions, the one that will be triggered, that will determine your next life. This occurs even before you stop breathing. And it's in that period, if you have to choose when to help your grandma, that's when she needs you most. Of course, it's ideal to prepare the whole life for your death, but that is when she needs you most, because it's at that time that the karmic seed that will determine your next life, which is in your mind, will be triggered. And crucially, simply speaking, we've got millions of negative seeds and we have lots of positive seeds, fortunately, because of everything we think and do and say, as we know from the law of karma, drops into our little bank vaults. Nothing goes astray, you know. Nothing goes in one ear and out the other. Everything we think and do and say leaves a seed in the mind. And so at the time of death, what we want most is for one of our very positive, virtuous, non-killing karmic seeds to be triggered, because that is what will give us a human rebirth. The cause of our getting this human rebirth was that one of our many karmic seeds in our bank vaults was triggered before we stopped breathing in the past life, which is a few weeks before you found your way to your own present mother's fallopian tube, where your mind joined the egg and the sperm of your mummy and daddy, you know. So what the key cause of that, of our finding a human mother, is nothing to do with your father and mother. They're just lying there having fun, and you come barging in, you know, really and truly. That's the karma you created in the past of non-killing. And as Lama says, this life we've got now, with these conditions that we've got now, which are pretty reasonable if we compare with the rest of the world, is not just from being good. Being good is not enough. It's one from very strong, conscious, intentional non-killing, most likely, he said, practiced in the framework of keeping vows of non-killing. There's something super potent about keeping vows that gives enormous power to the actions we do. So one of those, a non-killing karmic seed, the main action of morality, non-killing, one of those was triggered. And then what gives us these conditions we've got, that's the result of generosity, but also the fact that we have access to a spiritual path and even want that. That's because we've practiced in the past. So all these incredible conditions came together from our own past actions. It's not good luck. It's not God, not Buddha, not mummy, not daddy, not random. It's our own past hard work. So in order for that positive seed, that in our case was triggered before we stopped breathing, about the time we stopped breathing, we'll go into the death process. What enabled that to be triggered, as opposed to a negative seed being triggered, we've got lots of those in our bankroll, that's for sure, everybody has, was the way we died. We must have died peacefully, and we must have probably had some familiarity with the spiritual path, with you know, certainly the Buddhist one. That's why we're sitting here. So why a negative one wasn't triggered was because we must have had a reasonably peaceful death. In general, death is not peaceful for most of us until we're highly realized, because at the time of death, Lama Zopa talks about it in the book. There's a chapter on the 12 links at the time of death. There's particular teaching of the Buddhas in the sutras, the 12 links of dependent arising, which is basically this process we go through second by second, and how we continually creating countless cycles of rebirth, like every day, you know. But there's a particular role of the 12 links at the time of death. And so at the time of death, before you stop breathing, and that's when you discuss the tantric model of what happens at death, those 8 stages. We're going to go through both of these kind of together. The stages of death described in the Vadriana, it starts when you stop, you know, it starts probably a couple of hours before you stop breathing. Probably a couple of hours, but it varies from person to person, obviously. And so that when there's these 8 stages that occur, there's 8 stages, this gradual deconstruction, basically, of this person that you are. So first of all, the gross consciousness ceases, and that's your sensory consciousness. And the first 4 stages, you know, the different components of the body and mind, which is obviously the Tibetan, the Vadriana system, not the modern materialist view of the person. So the first, you know, various things occur at each of these 4 stages. Various components cease functioning at each of these 4 stages. So by the 3rd stage, when you've still got your wits about you, you know, your ear consciousness is starting to go, your eye consciousness is starting to go, but you've still got your wits about you. It's about this point that a very powerful grasping, an intense level of very powerful craving and grasping, which happen to be the 8th and 9th links, which occur every second of the day, but particularly at the time of death, this craving, which is another word for attachment, and then grasping, another word for attachment. And attachment, as we all know, is Lord Buddha's, you know, explanation of why we suffer. It's a major cause of our suffering, this primordial, constantly grasping at something, clinging to something, needing something, anticipating something, possessing something, looking forward to something, holding on to something. All of this is the function of attachment, and it's primordially deep in all of us, you know. So this kicks in really powerfully, Lama Zopa says, at the time of death. So the craving, the first one, the 8th link, which is powerful, is the craving not to let go of what you've got. Think about, this is a powerful function of attachment. So if you think about, you know, one of the functions of attachment is always to anticipate something. Always looking forward. Tomorrow I'll do this, and then lunch, and then dinner, and then get up, and then go to bed, and then my pension, and then this, and then go to retreat. I mean, we're endlessly anticipating, constantly anticipating, looking forward to something, looking forward to something. That's what keeps us perky all day. We get depressed because we've got nothing to look forward to. The mind is sunk into misery, you know. So attachment keeps us perky. It's a delusion. It's always fantasizing about the future. But another function of attachment is to hold on to what you've got, fearful of losing it. And this is the power of attachment at the time of death. I mean, we've died countless lifetimes, but of course we all forget it. But it's instinctively programmed in us. And this fear is so intense. So, you know, not way beyond normal fear, apparently. That kicks in. This craving, this fear of holding on to, of losing this. So, of course, this means this body. And as Lama Zopa says, that's what we think I am. We think I am the body. The body is the most tangible, evident evidence of myself. That's what we cling to so mightily. Now, so this is why, to alleviate that fear, to be ready for that, is the best way to be ready for death. That means we've got to start preparing for death now. So that's how we know in the sutra teachings, you know, the way Atisha presents and the way Tsongkhapa presents in the Lam Rim. The first thing we have to, the very first step in the Lam Rim, entry level junior school grade 1 in the Lam Rim, is think about impermanence, please. So Buddha has extensive teachings in Buddhism about this philosophical view, this view of the universe, that things come into existence in dependence upon causes, and whatever depends upon causes will change moment by moment. And then whatever depends upon causes at the gross level will die, lamps break, relationships end, computers, you know, stop, cups fall over, people die. So a teacher could easily have got us to think about impermanence. Subtle impermanence is very fascinating in Buddhist teachings. It actually can be confused for emptiness. But a teacher's agenda here, and of course his text is the basis of Tsongkhapa's Lam Rim. The agenda is to give us a wake-up call. To think this precious life, we first thought about the preciousness of this life, as a teacher gets us to do, and then but this life will end at any moment. We will die. I mean, subtle impermanence is very fascinating. You have to meditate on it at a subtle level, and it's kind of be very interesting, but it's not very powerful for us. But whereas even impermanence of your relationships, impermanence of your computers, that's kind of intense. But the one that really gets us between the eyeballs, of course, is the impermanence of me, this package, you know. So that's a teacher's agenda, to give us a wake-up call, to think about impermanence, but to give us the wake-up call to not waste this precious life. Because so there's 3 points we have to meditate on, 3 points we have to think about. And this is how we should be living our lives, you know. The first point is that death is definite, folks. We'll go, yeah, all right, we know that, mate. Give us something more, talk about something more exciting, like emptiness, please. Yeah, we know that death is definite. But Buddha says, no way we know death is definite. We know it intellectually. Nobody would admit nobody would admit they're not going to die. Nobody would admit to thinking you won't die. Of course not. But we live in denial of it. And this is what we have to learn to see. We're living in denial of this fairly evident truth. I mean, we're living in denial of everything. We're living in denial of ego, of how reality is actually, ultimately. But that's much more subtle. This is obvious, but we still live in denial. Because why? Because we have this massive attachment to me. Attachment to this, attachment to that. And the function of attachment is I don't want to let go of it. I don't want to not have it. So that blinds us to then thinking and projecting onto things that somehow we're impermanent. I mean, we know we're not. We look in the mirror, you can see you're not permanent. We can see we're heading towards death, but we don't want to think of it this way. It's so primordial. And this is our culture, you know. So the first thing to think about is death is definite. How do you think about that? Well, you observe it outside in front of you. You don't have to close your eyes to think about it. Look at the world. Whoever comes into being will die. And then you see it from the outside. It doesn't get us yet. But if you say that'll happen to me, Paponka Rinpoche got that lovely, text called Heart Spoon, which is about impermanence. And the ending, the last line in each verse is, this will happen to you. That's when you get the wake-up call. You see the ant die. You see people out there die. You see strangers die, and it reminds you, Then you say, that'll happen to me. Then it becomes a wake-up call. But we don't want to think about that. We can't bear it because we're attached. And as Lama Zopa says, attachment to me, the body, is the main reason there is so much unbearable suffering at the time of death. So you can't just counteract that overnight. You've got to practice all your life, confronting the reality, beginning to live within the framework of the truth that I am an impermanent thing, moving towards death. There's a way of thinking about it. So then, of course, we think, well, that sounds very depressing. I'm moving towards death. And then especially if you think the second point, which is, not only is death definite, the time of death is very uncertain. In other words, I could die today. Best to think, Rinpoche says, I could die today. Now, then we think, well, if I think I'm going to die today, the first thought that arises in our mind is, well, then why bother doing anything? But that proves we've got this nihilistic view that, that things must be permanent. Because if you could die today, we think, what's the point? But the whole point is this, that you could die today. In fact, the day you die, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be funny, but the day you die is called what? You never die yesterday. You never die tomorrow. You die today. Well, you might as well get used to it and practice thinking, I will die today. It just mightn't be this today, that's all. But when it comes, you'll be ready for it. And then, of course, what the action point is the third point. So yes, you might die today. So then we say, so what? The action point is the third point. That at the time of death, which is the separating of this body and mind, basically. At that time, you have to think practically. It's a practical issue, not religious. It's a practical issue. At that time, when the mind leaves the body, you leave the bag of bones in the bed. When you die, the mind continues. What is of use to us? What's useful? What if you're going to go somewhere? What would you pack? What's useful to you? Well, you're going to go to the next body. Think of it like this. It was really interesting. I remember when Steve Jobs died. I love Steve Jobs, and I read about his sister. They'd met later in life. They'd both been given away when they were young, and they met later in life. And it was like something like she said he was packed, ready to go. I think it's very powerful. In other words, I know from reading his stuff that he wrote and talks he gave 3 or 4 years before he died. He had some liver cancer, so he was totally in touch with it. He was totally in touch with death and impermanence, and all his talks were clearly in that framework. He wasn't living in La La Land. He was coming to terms with the reality of death. And I did hear, actually, I read one of his daughter's memoirs, daughter from his previous marriage, and in San Francisco there's this Brazilian Lama. He's been recognized as a Rinpoche by Lati Rinpoche, and he's a friend of mine. Satasitu, I can't think of his name. He's a friend of mine. But I heard that he was with Steve Jobs helping him, not at the time of death. So obviously he had some connection with Buddhism, and I was very happy about that, So anyway, he's packed. His sister said he was packed, ready to go. The way he even was with his daughters, he was like blissful, because he was ready for death. He was prepared for it. And we all know in our own life, it's very practical. If you have to do a driving test, you don't say, oh, I'll be okay on the day. I'll drive then. No, you won't. You'll be a total failure. You've got to prepare. It's sort of obvious, but we don't like to think this way. That's why Rinpoche was shocked when this woman, she's a friend of mine, a nun, she didn't know what to do. She panicked, because we can't bear to think about it. So the best way to prepare for death is live your life well. This is even before if you don't know the tantric one, don't know the 8 stages of death according to the Vadriana. If you don't even know that, you will die blissfully if you've lived a life of virtue, if you've lived your life with kindness, if you've lived your life living in your vows, keeping your practice, recognizing impermanence every day. Why? Because if you were going to die today, what's the point of hanging on to that nonsense? You've got the fight with your husband. What's the point? What's the point of clinging to that money in the bank when you have to leave it behind? So you've got this impermanence. All the lamas say, when you start to realize death and impermanence, it gives incredible perspective to your life. Forget about emptiness. Forget about bodhicitta. This is the first one. It suddenly puts things in proper perspective. Because the attachment to holding on to things is our greatest suffering. So when you realize you could not have it, you realize you could be gone tomorrow, then you realize there's no benefit in clinging, It's a very powerful antidote to clinging, a very powerful antidote to attachment, to your beloved, to your things, your pension plan, your reputation, you name it. If you really think that it is in its nature impermanent, and because we're not clairvoyant, we do not know logically when we will die. There's this one little story all the lamas tell, I love it, about this astrologer, Tibetan astrologer, and he'd done his own chart. And he was reading his chart, and it said that he would die today. So the first thing that occurred to him was, oh, where did I make a mistake? He just assumed it was a mistake. So apparently the story goes, he's sitting there with his arm resting on the windowsill, something like this, and there's a wooden shutter, and he's poking some pointy thing in his ear while he's contemplating what mistake he made in his own astrological chart. And the shutter came and pushed his elbow, and it went in, and he died. You're supposed to laugh at that, because he didn't believe he's going to die. He immediately did not believe his own astrological chart, trying to work out where did he make a mistake. This is brilliant. This is how we are. This shows the depth of this assumption that I'm permanent, that I'm, we sort of know that death, but there's you can't see it, a long way away, isn't it? And so the feeling we've got to get is cultivate this feeling from saying every day, when you wake up in the morning, okay, one day closer to death. Or first of all, you wake up, I didn't die yet. Petrol tank of morality didn't run out yet. Not dead yet, you tell yourself. Then you go one day closer to death. And it's a fact. If I'm driving from here to Taos, I've done it a few times, and I used to when I was living 20 years ago, but I forget now. And you check each signpost, don't you? And you go, and you get a sense, you have a real vivid feeling. We know how long it takes. You have a vivid feeling from moving away from Santa Fe and then towards Taos. We all know this. It's a very strong experience. You're moving towards, and you're feeling there's only 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and then you get to Taos. So we've got to live our lives like that, but we don't. You wake up every morning, and here I am, old, closer to death than birth, that's for certain, but still you feel that death is just as far away. It's like Taos keeps moving in front of you as you're driving towards it. That's how idiotic we are. This is evident for every being. This is even in the bones of the rats and the dogs and the monkeys. This assumption of permanence, this assumption of it's solid and concrete and not changing. This is very powerful. So we live our lives this way and realize, and then we add to that component, add the component of karma, which is this basic view in Buddhism, that every millisecond you are producing the person you become. You are producing yourself. You're not made by your mummy or daddy or God or somebody else, or you're not a random event. You're not a product only of circumstances and events. What goes on in your mind and what you do with your body and your speech, they are the components that produce the person you become. So we know logically, if we take the Buddhist view that our mind comes from before and it will continue, and we take the view that I don't want a dog birth and an animal birth and a cockroach birth and God knows what else birth, if you take that view, I want another human birth, please. So you've got to check up what are the causes of it. Well, live in vows, don't kill, don't harm, and do purify your mind every day. That's the minimum one. Then you can die with a happy mind, because karma is a natural law. Karma, these are the powerful things we should think to live our lives within, the rules, the laws within which we live our lives, in order to be ready for when death comes, which could be today. It's the quickest way. It's the best way to prepare. Then, of course, we can add to that, coming from the Vadriana, these different ways of explaining the 8 stages of death and learning to meditate on it and become much more familiar with it, so that when it does come, even some semblance of awareness can be useful to us to navigate these stages of this deconstruction of this package called me, So given that we've only got tonight to talk, we'll leave that one there. So we, take the view that we're going to live in the framework of impermanence, live in our vows, to keep our practice, to, abide by the laws of morality, purify every day. That's the way to live your life, to prepare for death. And then, of course, to think about, to remember impermanence repeatedly, so it becomes natural to us. So, okay. First of all, before even, one of the first, in the sections about how to help, the weeks and months before death, the really crucial thing is if you're the person, we're talking here to the person in this book who's in charge of this process. If you're about 5th in the totem pole and you have very little say over how grandma dies, then you can't implement much of this. But the assumption here is that you're in charge of the process of the death of the person, your beloved, your loved one whom you're trying to help, whether it's a dog or your grandmother or a baby. So, the first thing is and then we're talking obviously about a slow death. I mean, people drop dead in their soup, people die in car accidents, and there's still you do the same practices, but this is particularly, this first one is the first section, part, whatever it is, the practice is to do the months and weeks before. Well, the crucial thing, the ideal scenario to die is not in a hospital. I mean, it's not being rude to doctors and nurses, but it's about the worst place to die, because it's one of the things about as you're dying, as you're getting closer to death, the mind is necessarily getting more subtle. And then when the mind is more subtle, you're unbelievably sensitive to the tiniest noise, to the tiniest distress. So there you are in a hospital with everybody else around you, with their dramas and their family coming and going, and all the machines and the people there 24 hours a day, and the doors banging. It can be incredibly distressing for a person who's dying, especially if you're on your own, and all these poor tragic people who've got no loved ones and just left, like vegetables drugged out of their brains. It's the worst way to die. The best way to die is to be in a condition that you can control. So, you know, one of my friends, Trisha, an English nun who ran, I'm sorry, I have to stop for a second. She ran our centre in Bodgaya for years, same age as me. And she's in Australia. I forget now, many years ago she dies. Things go so quickly. You know, she was okay. She went to the hospital. She had some problem, and they said, you've got a couple of months to live. That's it, you know. So she told Lama Zopa, and he said, just, you might as well die there. No point in doing anything. Just die, you know, do your practice. So she found a really conducive place. There was this beautiful place next door to our centre up in the hills a bit, just out of Brisbane. Chen Raising Institute, but there was a really place right next door that was just beautiful. It looked like Bali, you know, this place had done so beautifully with beautiful views. So one of the things is to have a place, if the loved one is a sick person, old person, in their room, and the curtain can be open, and you've got the distance and the sky. It's so, everything has to be so conducive for that person's mind to be spacious and peaceful. Everything should be beautiful. So first she had beautiful views, you know, so she could just relax and space out, because as you're dying, you're getting, you know, more subtle. And in the room, you make it beautiful. Often sick rooms are like the ugliest rooms you can find, full of clutter and noise. It's like the worst, you know. You've got to be everything in that room should be for the benefit of the dying person, because many of the practices in the very first section, Rinpoche recommends, are related to the different senses, things to see, things to hear, things to taste, things to touch. Because the senses are really kind of sensitive at this point. So everything that the person hears, everything the person sees should be helping their mind. But let's assume, you know, she's a Buddhist, like my friend Trisha, the nun, should be helping her remember her Dharma, put imprints in the mind about her guru, put imprints in the mind of the Buddha, put imprints in the mind from the sutras, put imprints in the mind from the blessing strings, the prayer wheels, the stupas. This is like the perfect, you know, scenario for a Buddhist. And it can also be for a non-Buddhist. It can certainly be for your pussycat and your mouse. Put a stupa around, playing mantras all the time. You couldn't wish for better for your little doggy woggy or your pussy, or the mouse for that matter. Don't go off to the vet and get it killed, which is what we tend to do. It's a blissful way to help them die. So the room should be beautiful, peaceful. And the next one, Rinpoche says, really stresses, really, if you're the one in charge of it, you don't have the troublemakers coming in. You don't have the people who come in who weep and yell and make trouble and complain about the will. I mean, I hear nightmarish situations about people dying, you know, people fighting over the dying daddy about the will, terrible things, you know. It should be unbelievably peaceful. The only people who should be in that room should be people either who are helping with you, who know what's going on, who are educated in this. This is education we all need, Lama Zopa says. And let's say there's, you know, you keep the pets out. I mean, this sounds very shocking for us in our culture, because in our culture, we conflate love and attachment. So we think Granny loves her pets. No, she's completely attached to her pussycat. So you don't want her to be attached to her pussycat at the time of death. No way. And anyway, I mean, and also you keep the pets out, you keep the troublemakers out, you really organize it nicely. You don't become like a policeman, but you make it so that everything that goes on is for the benefit of the dying person, especially even if they're unconscious. In our culture, we think if a person's unconscious, they can't hear. Do not believe it. There are so many stories, I can tell you some, of people who are unconscious, on drugs, out of their brains, but are aware of what's going on. This is not unusual, because we've got the gross consciousness, which is our senses. Then we've got subtle consciousness, which is when we are dreaming, or when we're unconscious or in a coma. You can still be aware very vividly sometimes. So you've got to be so aware of this, you know. Whatever goes on in that room, the sound should be prayers and mantras. It shouldn't be gossip and rubbish and stuff. It should only be for benefit of the person who's in the bed. This is so important to think, which is not how we tend to think. We think if grandma's unconscious, we think it doesn't matter, you know. So completely the opposite. I mean, I remember a friend of mine in Sydney who was in the ICU, and she was deeply unconscious. They didn't think she'd come out, you know. And she was close to some of the lamas, like Sakya Trins and Songsai Khyentse Rinpoche. And I knew this. And so when she was in the hospital, I went to visit every night. And I'd asked the students of these lamas to pray for her, pray for Judy. So I did different prayers and things. And so every now and again, I'd whisper in her ear loudly, Judy, Songsai Khyentse Rinpoche is praying for you. Judy, His Holiness Sakya Trinzen is praying for you. And anyway, she came out of a coma weeks later. She was all perky and happy. And she said to me, the only thing she remembered from those weeks in a coma was this husky voice. She didn't know it was me. And she thought I was a blue lady coming through the window saying exactly those words. Judy, Songtsa Kensei Rinpoche is praying for you. Judy, His Holiness Sakya Trinzen is praying for you. I hear there's so many stories like this, you know. That's your subtle mind. And your ear, and you can be conscious at that level. And this is really crucial too when we talk about what happens after you've died, after you've, you know, died, after the breath has stopped, and in the different scenarios, what to do if your loved one dies at home, what to do if your loved one dies in hospital, what to do if your loved one gives their organs is a particularly important one. We'll discuss that. It's ridiculous you have to cover this whole thing in 2 hours. I've got to talk even quicker. We might have to continue it next year or something. Hopefully you don't die. So anyway, the weeks and months before, so there's all kinds of section on what to make the room beautiful, to make the helpers really, you know, conscious and aware, to make it best for the person. Then there's different things to touch, like touch prayer wheels, stupas, have mantras written on the body of, you know, written and put on the body of a person. We Catholics used to have these things. We had, any Catholics there, we have scapulars, didn't we? You know, scapulars. That's right, Mary. You put a scapula on, you know, we had prayers inside, similar things with Tibetan Buddhists. And Rinpoche is a great fan of all these things, you know. He'd have you wearing blessing strings, wearing scapulars, touching sutras, touching stupas, touching prayer wheels, hearing your guru's words. He'd be having you bombarded by the Dharma, you know. Anyway, okay, so then there's all the parts, and all these practices are in the book. And it's a bit overwhelming initially. And that's why I think my friend said she know what to do, because Rinpoche gives so much advice. But in the end, he said, if you want to choose one practice, one mantra, medicine Buddha, you can't go wrong, you know, medicine Buddha. But the more, you know, depending on the person, what their practice is, you can do particular ones. You have to find out what the person does and what they like, you know. Then there's a section on while they can still talk, what to talk about. Well, this is something that's always very stressful for people, because if the grandma hasn't admitted she's dying, or doesn't want to die, or lives in denial of dying, or whatever, you don't know how to talk, and we're all very nervous. We're nervous around dying people, you know. But you've got to be confident and loving and kind and real, you know. So one of the things to do, of course, depending on the person, let's say it was your grandma, let's say you know that she was a Catholic, but she never went to mass much, and she probably hasn't thought about God for a long time. You don't give her lectures about God, but you might talk to her about God. God loves you, Granny, you know. I mean, her mind at the moment is spaced out. She can't have these conscious thoughts. But just to hear that God loves me, she'll be blissed out. She'll suddenly have something to grab onto, which is very skillful. Or you tell about how heaven is beautiful. Because this is an interesting point that Lama Zopa said. At the time of death, because, you know, you do not want to let go, because most people have no idea where they're going, because they don't know. I mean, if you're a materialist, the only place you think you're going to go is to fall into a black hole, and nobody wants to fall into a black hole of oblivion. So it's very scary. If you're a very devoted Christian, then you will look forward to heaven, and that's very skillful. As I said, that's how you use your attachment. So, you know, you've got attachment, like a little kid who's holding a sweetie, holding a candy in this hand and will not let go. So how you trick them is give them a candy in this hand so they forget this one and drop it. That's what we have to do. We've got to be skillful. So instead of telling your grandma to let go all the time, you tell her how wonderful heaven is. You tell her how wonderful God loves her. She will start to look forward to heaven, and her mind will calm down. She'll be able to let go of this one. That's using attachment, as Rinpoche said. It's very skillful. The same with a Buddhist. If you're looking forward to a new human rebirth, you can look forward to that, so you can relax your mind instead of being fearful and letting go of this one. It's very skillful means. So you talk about, you know, for a Buddhist, you talk about if the teacher, you talk about Lama Zopa, you listen to teachings, you listen to mantras. Rinpoche has got so many mantras in this book. It took me weeks and weeks and weeks to cobble them all together, you know, so complicated. You read sutras, there's so many things you can do. Because basically for the person, let's say they're a Buddhist, whatever they see, hear, you know, touch, it should help put karmic imprints in their mind to help them be peaceful and virtuous. That's the bottom line, peaceful and virtuous. That's it. That's the purpose. So, of course, in the materialist world, we don't think that way, because we think the thing is to keep them alive, to give them drugs, to keep them to be, we think peaceful means give them drugs. And I'm not saying that can't be good, but there's a big interesting point there, because we tend to say, oh, look, you've given her the drugs. Oh, look at grandma, she's so peaceful, because she's unconscious. But, you know, you could be fast asleep next to your husband one night and you look very peaceful, and you can wake up and tell him you had this terrible nightmare. See, that's your subtle consciousness. And that's what a coma mind is, the subtle consciousness. So you can medicate Physical pain, you cannot medicate mental anguish, because you'll just have nightmarish comas. It doesn't make you peaceful, because your body looks peaceful. And that's because the Buddha's got a very different view of the mind, you know. So to be aware of this, it's really crucial that the person to try and find the way to navigate between unconscious and conscious. So that means to be able to, you know, to manage the drugs. Often in the old people's homes and the hospitals, there's just people are overwhelmed with hard work, so the best just to have them drugged out of their brain. But this is not cool. It's not the best way to do it. You've got to be much more skillful about it, because it's important that they are conscious as much as possible. So if the pain is so bad, you've got to find a way to navigate this, you know. And if the pain is so bad and you medicate the pain and they're semi-unconscious, then you make sure you have mantras playing the whole time, because that will go in much deeper and will help their mind, you know. What to think about, when the person's able to be talking, lots of things. And one of the crucial things to talk about when they're still conscious is we never think of our own good qualities, do we? So certainly granny and mum, you know, aren't thinking about their own good qualities. When you're worried, they live their lives worrying about not being a good enough mother, not being a good enough wife, all the jobs they didn't do, they live in guilt. So they're constantly worried. And here you are dying, you're even more worried. So tell them good qualities, praise them, love them, thank them for what a good mother they were. Thank them for being so kind. Praise them for a wonderful job they've done. Be so loving and optimistic to them. This is like nectar to lift a person's mind, you know. This is miraculous. It's so easy to do that. Just love and praise the person. Look at them with love and kindness. Because when you realize when you're dying, when you're fearful, you're desperate to rely upon somebody. When we have bad things happen in life, think about this. When you have bad things happen, the first thing we think about is who to turn to. Whom can I turn to? Who can help me? Where is someone to turn to? We cry out for somebody, don't we? Be that person, you know. I mean, I even think when, like, you're in an old people's home and you're left for dead, and I'm not being horrible, even the cleaning lady can be so marvelous for the dying person, to be kind and loving to them, to look them in the eye with kindness and sweetness and praise them and love them. This is like a miracle to help a person. Lift their mind, to make them lighter, to make them a bit more optimistic. Talk about compassion, talk about this. There's so many things you can do to lift their mind, you know. Then many chapters like this. Prayers to do, practices to do, depending on the person. If they're a Buddhist, what meditations they do. You need to really know their practice well, because as you get sicker and sicker, you can't do your own practice. You can't even remember it, even if you used to. So you need to read them to the person. Know who their teachers are. So you play the tapes of their teachers, you know. During the night when they're asleep, have mantras on playing so subtle that it goes into the deepest unconscious. This is the most precious gift you can give. To animals as well. This is the best way to help animals. You can't talk about them. You can't talk to animals about things. You can if you like, but you can be loving and kind and give them a peaceful environment so their mind is peaceful, and you let them hear mantras and prayers. You can't do anything better for your animal than that, I promise you. Let them die at their own pace, hearing the Dharma. So we better keep going. We'll have some questions later. Okay, so what to think about, what to touch. You know, there's different things you do, special blessed pills you can give them, mantras to put on their body, prayer wheels, stupas to touch, prayer strings, prayers to hear, meditations. There's a whole chapter on what meditations to do. You can guide them in meditations, on lovely meditations, lovely, very sweet, guide them, you know, mantras to hear, teachings to hear, videos, all these things, imprints in the mind, by seeing and hearing and touching. So as the time gets closer to death, I find that many doctors and nurses I talk to, especially nurses, they know somehow, I don't know what signs they use. I know some of you might have this experience, but they have a very strong sense when a person's going to die. But I mean, the Buddhist, this view of understanding these 8 stages is a different kind of set of criteria for knowing when a person could die. So it's always curious for me about how Western nurses know what's the sign, you know. Your grandma's going to die today, they say, must come, you know. So the thing is, if your grandma's going to die in hospital, It's really one of the most important things is you need to keep your wits about you and discuss in advance with the hospital. Don't wait until Granny dies and then you panic and hand over the power to them, and they're going to do their job by cleaning the body and putting it here and putting it there. One of the crucial things is you need as long as you can without touching the body after they've stopped breathing, because the mind can stay in the body for up to 3 days. This is a major point in the West, especially when it comes to giving organs, which we'll talk about. Because, the gross mind, that ceases when you've stopped breathing. But because we only posit that in our culture, then we think the person's dead. But they're not dead yet. As Lama Zopa calls it, the outer breath has stopped. So, this is the Vadriana model. We've got gross consciousness, which is inextricably linked with our gross bag of bones, the 5 senses. Then we've got subtle consciousness, which is, and this subtle physical energy. This is how they talk in the Tibetan medical system. It's similar to the Chinese, similar to the Ayurvedic, and similar to how we used to talk 1,000 years ago, probably 800 years ago in the West. So you've got this subtle physical energy, there's 72,000 subtle channels coursing through your body like a subtle nervous system. And coursing through those channels are all these different wind energies. This is the basis of all health, according to the Tibetan medical system, similar to the Chinese. All these different prana, these different kinds of wind energies, all related to your health. And what's fascinating in this system, the Vadriana, the subtle states of mind, all our mental states are going through all these channels linked to their own wind energies. So you can go to your Tibetan doctor, she'll feel your pulses and she'll feel the imbalance of certain winds, and she knows immediately that's the wind energy connected to your attachment, and that's why you're having panic attacks, anxiety. So she'll give you herbal medicine that'll calm down those winds, which in turn will impact upon your attachment mind that is connected to those winds. It's very subtle, this connection between the wind energies, which is physical, subtle physical, and our different states of mind, So the gross mind and gross body cease at the time when the breath stops. Then you've got your subtle consciousness, which but that's equivalent to your dreaming. In other words, these 8 stages are exactly the same stages we go through when we go to sleep. The difference is death is just more radical. Your breath doesn't stop when you go unconscious, but it's more quiet, doesn't it? So then your subtle consciousness is now manifesting, and that's when you have dreams. That's your subtle consciousness, these weird experiences we have. Well, that's the same level as the coma, and that's the same level as when you stop breathing and you're technically dead, but your subtle mind is still there. And that can be up to 3 days before it leaves the body. And because it could disturb the person if you start moving them around and cutting out their organs and everything before they've died, it's really quite difficult, which we'll discuss in a minute. So the best scenario is why being at home is the best scenario, where you can navigate the whole thing and let your grandmother be there for 3 days. This is very typical in the monasteries. So when people die, Buddhists, you let the person stay there and you rotate, coming in and out, saying prayers and mantras. And you leave and the place is like a shrine room, totally quiet, totally peaceful, and you leave the body be. And then there are ways of checking whether the mind has left. And after the 3 days, it's pretty certain. They say that it usually leaves before 3 days, But that's a difficulty in the hospital. Maximum, you have a half an hour if you're lucky. But if your loved one is dying in hospital or in a nursing home, okay, if you've got enough funds and you can rent a private room, then fine, lock the door. I mean, a friend of mine in Melbourne, when her husband died, she shooed out the doctors and nurses and locked the door, and she stayed there for 3 days with him. I mean, she was paying the rent. It was okay, If you can do that at home, it's perfect. So hospital, you let the doctors and nurses know. And I've found in hospitals, when I go to visit people who have been dying or dead, they're very kind. They're very happy to accommodate, especially these days. So you tell them you mustn't, so let's say your grandma's in hospital and you've gone home for the night, and you let them know on night duty, if she does die, do not touch her. Call me immediately. So you go there, and don't touch as long as you can. And if you're there when Granny does die, when she stops breathing, don't rush in and get the doctors and nurses. No. Take as much opportunity as you can to do prayers and practice, and the particular ones are all there in the book to do for your loved one, for Granny, and leave her as long as you can. When Lama Yeshe passed away, Lama Zopa talks about it in the book, in Los Angeles, in a hospital there. He said they were very kind. The Lama stopped breathing at dawn, and then they took him very gently on the gurney to a spare room, and the hospital allowed Lama Zopa and many students to be there all day with Lama Yeshe doing practices for him. or not for him, but for themselves, on the gurney. Then they took his body. And then, but these yogis, one of the scenarios, what to do if your loved one is a yogi, the best way to help your loved one when they're dead is lock the door and let they know what they're doing. Mind your own business. Keep out of their way. They can meditate at the subtlest level. That's what they need most. And many lamas, Lama Zopa did it for 5 days. Lama Yeshe, after he passed away, even when his body was driven right down in Northern California to Southern California, other way around, he was meditation the whole time in a subtle level. Looked like he's dead, but then the body doesn't rot when that happens. It stays all warm and flexible, That's how it was for Lama Yeshe. So for your loved one, you take as long as you can. You try and have privacy, and you do whatever prayers and practices you can, And then even as Lama Zopa says, if your loved one dies in hospital, one of the things you can do, is you can ask the hospital to put him in the fridge, put your granny in the fridge, in the morgue, in the hospital. They're very used to doing that, waiting for relatives to come and that kind of thing. And that way she won't get disturbed. And you can then do this practices at home for 3 days. Then you come and get the body later. Granny won't mind, Unless, of course, she comes back to life. That's a problem. I'm going to talk about this when I talk about giving the organs. So there's these different scenarios, what to do once your breath has stopped. But the death process is the one I want to go through now, actually what happens according to these 8 stages, okay? So the first level is the gross consciousness ceases. And so there's 4 stages here, and various things occur at each of those 4 stages. And this is all related to the components of a person according to the Buddhist view, So we've got the 5 aggregates, we've got the senses, we've got the 4 elements. So the very first of the first stages, excuse me, I'm running out of voice. The eye consciousness ceases to function. When you see, this happens every time you go to sleep, and when you're really tired and you're talking to a friend and you're sitting up, but you're really tired, you can hardly keep your eyes open, can you? We know this experience because everything is beginning to absorb inwards. Your body feels like lead. That's because the earth element is ceasing. The eyes are kind of glazing over and you can't see much. Your eyes are open still, but you can hardly see anything. We have that experience. All of these energies are sinking inwards, ceasing to function. Then also keep it simple, there's also a particular capacity of the mind. They call it these different kinds of wisdoms. All they mean is the different ways the mind functions. So this first one that ceases to function is the ability to hold a lot of information in your mind all at once. We all know you can't do that. And then your eye conscious goes, the earth element ceases, your body becomes heavy. And then they label these 8 stages in terms of a certain subtle vision that occurs every time we go to sleep, every time we die, but which we're not conscious of, but the yogis are conscious of. So this one is called the vision of the mirage. So the mirage is like there's a subtle vision that the yogis can see. So that it's like an interplay between, it's like a mirage, meaning there's a subtle vision of like a mirage, meaning an interplay of earth and water, isn't it? That's how it appears, isn't it? So that occurs. And the next stage is your water element begins to dry up. Your ability to distinguish between pleasure, pain, and indifference begins to cease. Your ear consciousness starts to go. So it's about this point that this other, from the sutra teachings, the 12 links, that this craving and grasping kick in very powerfully. And this is what causes fear. So it's at this point when the grasping kicks in, which is even stronger than the craving. The grasping literally is the trigger for the karmic seed, which is in the 12 links, the number 2 link. The grasping is the number 9 link. The number 2 link, it triggers the karmic seed that will be the one to kind of pop out of your bank vault like the ATM card, it'll pop up. That'll be the seed that determines your next life. And even though the grasping is always there, but if you're used to this and if you've practiced throughout your life and you're hearing the guru's name or you're hearing the mantras and your loved one is helping you navigate this, fear will be there, but it won't be so frantic. And then what that will do, that will trigger a virtuous karmic seed. And that's what happened in our case. The grasping kicked in. It's a technical thing. It's like putting in the password and the money comes out. That grasping is the trigger, and that triggers the karmic seed. And in our case, we can deduce logically, it was a very strong, virtuous, non-killing karmic seed. And as Lama Zopa says, practice in the framework of keeping vows, because that became the cause for us to get a human mummy. This is before you've even died. Your mother and father mightn't even have met yet. They don't make you. They give you a body. They give you a house. That's it. You create the cause to go to their egg and sperm, you know. So then, and now this is the point now. From this point, if a virtuous karmic seed has been triggered, and this is one of the signs, Rinpoche says, if a virtuous karmic seed has been triggered about that point, we haven't stopped breathing yet, you will be blissful. You will be joyful. Death will be a blissful experience, because as your mind's getting more subtle, as your mind's getting less gross and more subtle, it's like you can see the future. I mean, I know it sounds very corny, but karma takes care. Your perfect human rebirth is coming, you know. So they say that once the mind is virtuous, death is a very joyful experience. And, you know, you hear about people, I'll talk about Steve Jobs, you hear about people kind of like they're looking into the distance going, oh, look, like it's all blissful and radiant. They're seeing, even they say in the Buddhist text, it's like going towards the light, because your mind's getting more subtle. So when Steve Jobs died, I love this. His sister said, she wrote about it, and she was there. She came that day. And there he was lying on the bed, as skinny as a rake. He'd been sick for ages with his cancer, and his two daughters were there. And so she's sitting here where I am, and just in front of her is Steve, and Steve is facing her. And then, but in front of Steve is his two daughters. All she can see is their heads, and she's looking at Steve. And she said his face, I forget the words roughly, it was like joyful. And he was looking at these two daughters with such love, begging them to forgive him for having to leave them. In other words, not frantic, not attached, not grasping, wishing he wasn't going to die, really blissful. And then she said he looked over their shoulder into the distance and he went, oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. And then he died. Well, all I can deduce from that is that that's an indication that he's either going to the God realms or the Pure Land realms. So I'm very happy for him. This is how they talk. Now, if a negative seed is triggered, death will be hideous. And this is very common for people, freaking out, hallucinating, screaming, their eyes going back in their head. I remember one nun I know in Queensland who sits with the dying. She said she'd never seen anything like this particular experience of this man freaking out, completely like a demon had entered into him. Everything was like, he was freaking, he's making noises she'd never heard before. His eyes back into his head, like hallucinate, like seeming like freaking out completely, horrified at what he was seeing. But then he became peaceful, and then he died peacefully. And she said, she asked one of her lamas, and they felt that he'd purified some hell realm karma before he passed away, and then he passed away very peacefully. And Lama Zopa told me, when I told him this story, and it's in the book, Lama Zopa told me that he heard about some other person like that as well. You know, so that's you. If you're the person navigating this, you don't freak out. You just try and do what you can, help them hear the Dharma no matter what. But if a negative seed is triggered, the death is very, very freaked out, because you're seeing your suffering rebirth coming. That's how they say. It's very distressful, very distressing. So it's about that time before they even stop breathing, when they've still got their wits about you, when they can hear the Dharma and hear the advice. That's when the karmic seed is triggered. That's when it's crucial that you're there to help them navigate, giving them everything they need, you know, to help them be peaceful and virtuous. That's the point. So the next one is the air element ceases. The tactile consciousness ceases. The tongue consciousness ceases. And that tongue, apparently the tongue gets short and turns blue at the root. I don't know. But Geshe Rabchen, one of Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe's teachers and one of my teachers, he said, and that tongue that has spent its life gossiping is now useless. And then the breath goes out and it doesn't go in again. And at this point, the wisdom that you lose, the second, the fourth, the third one, the wisdom to even distinguish between your friends and enemies and strangers, like your beloved Lama, your beloved auntie might be on the left and your mean, ugly husband on the right. You can't tell the difference. You've lost the plot. You're getting less and less capable as you die. And eventually the fourth wisdom to go is you don't even know who you are. You can't put anything together. You think a thought and you don't know what to do with it, because you've lost it now. And then you stop breathing. Now that's death for the West, and it is not death for this view. And that's from this time, you have to be extra cautious, make it beautiful, the place quiet, playing prayers, ideally all the time, and keep them there for 3 days. That's the best for your pussycat as well, if you can. So what happens in a dying person Yeah, the subtle consciousness is manifesting. Of course, you're not conscious. You're unconscious. Most of us are not yogis. We can't see what's happened. We're unconscious. But this is what happens anyway. Your mind keeps getting more subtle, more subtle, more subtle. There's no time to go into too much detail. But then you finally, the 8th stage of death is what they call the clear light consciousness. The 8th, when all the gross physical energies get ever more subtle, ever more subtle, ever more subtle. All the gross mind gets more subtle, more subtle, more subtle, until eventually everything subsumes to the very subtle consciousness, which is inextricably linked to the very subtle wind energy. These are inextricably linked. It's just the way the universe is. Every mind has its own set of the 4 elements. So, and then for an ordinary person, you're unconscious at this point. You're unconscious. And all the energy, the physical and mental energy, everything is absorbed to the center of the chest where the heart chakra is. There are different chakras, and they're like these channels throughout the body, and there's different constrictions of channels at different points. So the one of the heart chakra, and that's where you first begin in your mother's womb. So from the past life, when we came running from the intermediate state and our very subtle mind joined with the egg and the sperm of the mother and father, what they actually joined with was this subtle red and white drop, they call it, which is a subtle physical energy from the mother and father. And then our very subtle consciousness joins with that, and then we begin right there at the heart chakra. That's where it begins. And then we gradually grow all the bits. And death is everything comes back to that indestructible drop, they call it, which came from the mother and father. And when that indestructible drop opens, then your very subtle consciousness leaves. And from that second, you now are finished. Robina is gone. You now go the reverse 8 stages, and then you wake up in like this dream state, which is called the intermediate state. But Robina's over. Even if you can see your body, Lama Zopa says, there's no recognition. The karma is finished. Even you see your family, the body, it's all gone. You have no recognition. The karma is completely over. You're now this intermediate state person, and it's like a dream state, can last up to 7 weeks. And you're basically waiting for your new mummy and daddy to hop into bed, to get your new body. And whether it's a dog birth, whatever it is, but you're waiting for your new body to come. And probably if you're going to be born as an animal, there's not much waiting around. There's lots of animal wombs available, but not so many humans. So you could wait up to 7 weeks, or could be, it's much more complicated than that. I'm just keeping it simple. And then when mummy and daddy hop into bed and the egg and sperm come together, you run like a magnet. You leave the intermediate state and you go attracted intensely to that egg and sperm, and you rush in, and that's the beginning of the new person. That's roughly how we die and how we get reborn. Any questions about anything so far? We still have another hour to go. Any questions about all that so far? Yes, sweetheart. Pamela, what is it doing?
Okay. So I just wonder, from a Buddhist perspective, what is that then when someone has died and then people feel like they get communication from those people?
I know, that's a very interesting point. It's a very, very, very common experience, isn't it? All I can do is tell you what I know from the Buddhist view. I can't tell you from experience. I can only give you the Buddhist understanding, and then we have to try and see if that makes any sense, So there's different kinds of rebirths, okay? There's animal, which is obvious. I mean, if your grandma has been reborn as a dog, it is not likely she's talking to you. It's not possible. The dog is sitting there in this new owner in Timbuktu or somewhere. That's it. It can't be. But if she could be, you'd be born as a god realm. In the god realm, you're like devas or gods, and they're very subtle physical energy, and they can be some very virtuous people. They can be very kind. So that's how the Christians talk about heaven. You understand? They won't look like your grandma. We think they look like your grandma, but it could be the reincarnation of your grandma or your father, let's say, as a god. And they can be like useful. The devas can be quite helpful. They're not enlightened beings, but they can be quite helpful. They could be. So it's a possibility. It's a god, but that you're talking to, or is somebody, I mean, it could be the possibility that. The other one is it could be a spirit, which is not cool. Spirits are really suffering, really unhappy, really deluded beings who can be, some of them very powerful, can be very misleading. So those who tell you that you're Mozart, and the more Mozart's coming to tell you, and that kind of thing. It's just spirits, very manipulative, very harmful, and it could be, it's possible, it could be your mother, but it's surprising that she would know who you are. So that's one example. Another, I mean, if it's a hell being, forget it. They're so intensely suffering, there wouldn't be any possibility of hanging around a hell being. But so the spirits or the gods, it seems to me, there's only those 2 options. In Buddhist terms, they're the only 2 options. They're the only 2 options. The other one is... What? What, dear?
So yeah, you're saying the spirits it's not. So I'm just trying to make sense of some of the experiences that I've heard about. You know,
Understand, you, darling. I'm just, that's why I'm answering you. I can only give you the Buddhist explanation. I can't tell you their
yeah,
experience.
no, I'm just wondering about the spirits. You were saying that's not a good thing, and
No,
usually
spirits
with
are really heavy, super suffering beings, super suffering. Some are less so, some are more so, some are more harmful, some are more powerful, some are very, you know, like many people who hear voices, that's spirits interfering with you, harming you terribly. But to say that, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've heard so many stories, but I'm just trying to give you the Buddhist view. You've only got so many options. You've got the God realms, you've got the humans, you've got the animals, you've got the spirits, and you have the hell beings. That's samsara, honey. You've got the beings in the formless realm. They're too busy in subtle concentration to bother coming around to people. So it's a possibility even from the, I mean, even in the, maybe the intermediate state beings, it's a possibility it could be them. I just don't know. I can't tell you. All I can do is give you the Buddhist explanation and see if it fits, if you can fit the experience into that. I can't tell you anymore. But the commonest one,
yeah, no, I don't.
common one will be spirits, and they're usually very harmful, manipulative, and misleading. All the ones, many people who say they're channeling different people, they're just spirits manipulating you. This is what the Buddhists would say.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you.
All I can tell you is that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a real good answer either way because
No,
I'm
I'm
trying
giving
to
you the answer from the Buddhist point of view, darling. I'm telling
yeah,
you.
no, I understand that. I
Yeah,
I understand that. I'm just trying to because I'm trying to put together from the death, like the moment of death, and I'm understanding,
well, give me an
if it's a
example of
if it's a
what it's. Tell me an
well,
example.
like well, okay, so a friend of mine's son shot himself in the head about 2 months ago. And she's had communications with him and they're all wonderful communications. But I'm wondering if he shot himself on the head, that's not a positive, that's a fearful death. That's a fearful, horrible death.
That's all I'm trying. Yeah, that's all we can do is use the Buddhist view and explain what it could be like. It's likely he's born in the hell realms. It's likely he's born in the spirit realms. And if it is in the spirit realms, they're usually intensely suffering people. And so they're so freaked out. They're so distressed, the spirits. So if it is anybody, it could be a god, or it could be a spirit who are harmful, misleading. I mean, there's all kinds of these beings. There's so many kinds, So yeah, I mean, yeah. So this is the commonest experience I've heard as well. So common.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
a person who'd say that they're Mozart and they help you play piano like Mozart. I mean, Mozart probably be reborn 27 times since he died, in different human bodies somewhere. So it's spirits manipulating. They can be super manipulating and super harmful and super misleading. That's the way I've heard.
Okay.
There are some spirits who can cause earthquakes, some spirits who can so powerful with the weather, for example. I mean, there's so many kinds. I don't begin to know. So complex.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, darling. I know that kind of story. I've heard it so often myself. I can't explain. What else, people? No questions. Yes, Sarah, darling. Unmute, sweetheart. Unmute, darling. Yes.
Yes, my question is, what about people who are non-Buddhists who have never heard the Dharma,
Right.
say an Episcopalian or a
You do the prayers and practices suitable to them. You have to know the person, what they need to hear, how they are. If it's a communist, you got to be, I'm just giving you a typical Buddhist one, but you have to know the person's mind. You have to know where they're at, and you have to help them. The bottom line is, whether they're a communist or Episcopalian, your job is to understand where they're at and to help them become peaceful and virtuous. Bottom line, that's it. So,
and suppose they don't have the advantage of someone helping them over. Suppose they
don't. That's the tragedy, sweetheart. Most people don't. Most people die terrible deaths on their own, freaking out, no one to help them, and drugged out of their brain. It's so depressing. So to have a person who can help you when you die is the most miraculous gift to give somebody. Do you understand? Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. What else, people? Any other questions? Okay.
Well, I have another question.
Good, darling, good.
suppose this person who is helping you die, does it matter whether it's a loved one or a person who perhaps you don't know that well, but just has good intentions?
I understand. I mean, I think in the end, you know, in the end, you think about it, Sarah, if you're the person who's in bed sick even, you're going to recognize a person who comes up to you immediately, who's kind to you. And if it could be the cleaning lady, that she might be the most precious help for you than anybody you know. Maybe your daughter's rejected you, nobody else's, people are mean, but if you get, and we know when we're sick, there's one person, we can hold on to that person. If that person can help you, amazing. Best, of course, to be a person who knows you well and knows what you need. That's the best. But some people don't have the luxury of that. That's why if you do work in hospitals and you do, you know, you can be so kind and helpful just randomly to different people to give them some love and affection and help their mind be a bit quiet, you know. I mean, if a person is immediately kind to you, you'll recognize it straight away. You won't know whether, you won't care whether you know them. If they're kind to you, you'll hold on to that. It'll be beneficial for you, won't it? It's best, of course, to have a beloved friend whom you adore, you know. Of course, it's the best. And that person needs to know you well and know what you need. Do you understand? You need to tell them what you need.
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. So let's
I
continue.
have
then.
another question.
Yes.
Another question.
Yes, darling, go.
I take things quite literally, and so that whole thing about touching the body,
Yeah.
I had Geshe-la with me once when one of my dogs died, and I really thought that you couldn't touch the body, but it turns out it's about disturbing the body, so that actually means like picking up and moving.
Sure.
But then you said that it's okay.
Who told you that? Who told you that? I mean, just tell me more your experience from Geshe-la. What did Geshe-la?
Well, I told Geshe-la, he wasn't there because I did have my dog put down, but it was at home. And I, you know, made sure the vet was going to touch the dog to say, oh, you know, once he'd put the dog down, like pet the dog. And I said, no, don't touch the dog. And I didn't realize I was taking it so literally, don't even touch the dog. And then when I told Geshe-la, he said, no, it's okay to touch the dog. Oh, he saw me like.
Geshe-la's just kind of trying to relax you, that's all. The point is, I mean, it is literal, but you got to understand why. You got to understand the purpose behind it. It's not superstition. It's because, you know, if a person's dying, like I said before, when a person's dying while they're still alive, as you're getting more subtle, you become incredibly sensitive to even a slight noise, you know. So not to mention if people are banging your bed or clinging to your hands and crying and holding on to you and kissing you, this can be incredibly disturbing for your poor mind. It just rises your attachment 40 million times. That's the reason behind it, you know, or don't kissing your loved one and everything. So it's just to allow them to be there without being touched, meaning it's not a superstition, don't touch them, but it's obvious it'll disturb them. And usually when you touch people, it's because of emotion and fear or something, you know. So, I mean, and equally, if let's say then once the person has died, like your dog, I mean, depending on what happened to your dog's mind, because when the breath has stopped, and in the case of the dog, they give it a drug, don't they? What do they do to a dog? How do they kill it?
Yeah, they give it barbiturate or something. I don't know. They give the dog some stuff.
And what happens? The heart then stops.
Yeah.
The heart stops, right? Well, it's at that point. It's at that point that the karmic seed of the dog will be triggered. That'll determine the next life. So to put it this way, let's say your dog, you know, if let's say were you saying mantras in the dog's ear while they were killing it? You were?
Yes.
Okay, it's better than nothing.
Yes.
That's helpful. That could help. Hopefully that'll help your dog's mind. And if the Buddhas were there at the time and could help your dog's mind, then, you know, and let's say the mind hasn't left the body yet, and then you're picking up the body and doing things with it, that could be very disturbing. It could suddenly change the karma for the dog. It could distress their mind. And I'm going to talk about now, this is exactly what happens if you cut out organs. That's a really dramatic touching of the body. So it's best not to touch the body because it can disturb the mind. So Geshe-la was just trying to relax you, I think. Calm you down a bit. I've got a sense. There's logic to it. You have to understand what the reasons behind it, you know. So anyway, so there's different scenarios when you will die. Okay, one is at home, and as I said before, that's the best. You keep the body for 3 days. You have people coming in and doing mantras and prayers. You ring up Kopan Monastery. You ring up the different lamas. You get them to do prayers. You do as much as you can to help them, because the mind can be there for up to 3 days. And even though the karmic seed was triggered before they stopped breathing, it still can help their mind, because they're not dead yet. You know, it can help their mind create merit. It can help their mind hugely. Equally, if a negative karmic seed was triggered at the time they stop breathing, but they're still in their body, you can help change the karma. And that's just with your dog. You can help change the karma by doing prayers and practices right there. You know, it's so important. So the next scenario is if they're going to die in hospital. Well, the best you've got is a half an hour. But if you're really skillful, you keep as long as you can, do all the same practices as long as you can. And there's each stage, there's certain things you can do to check, has the mind left the body? You know, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the next scenario would be if your loved one dies suddenly. Well, the trouble is, because we're not ready for this, we panic. We freak out, you know. But to have your wits about you. So if suddenly your loved one dies and drops dead in the soup, or drops dead on the ground, or dying in a car accident, you've got to keep your wits about you and know what to do. Meanwhile, the doctors and the nurses do what they can, but you do what you can to help their mind. So incredibly important. I mean, a friend of mine in Santa Cruz years ago, the mummy and daddy and the daughter were all Buddhist, and the daddy had a really bad heart. And he got his wife to promise, if he had a heart attack, because he'd had so many, he said, do not resuscitate me. Don't call the ambulance, you know. But she panicked, and she did. So they took him to the hospital. He was all wired up, and we got there at dawn, and we could see he wasn't happy. He didn't want to be kept alive. He didn't want all this rubbish. So we did all the prayers that he wanted. And then they very kindly put him in the ambulance very gently. We said we went to the mortuary with him. So he moved the body very gently. We took it to the mortuary, spent all day there saying prayers and practices for him. And then we came back again the next day, and we did like that. So there's many ways you can. This doesn't say this in the book, because that was not Lama Zopa's story. But he said you could leave it in the fridge in the hospital. Ask them to move it very gently, put it in the fridge, and just leave it there. And you're home and you do all your prayers and practices. It's a possibility. Because the aim is as much as you can to leave the body before the mind leaves. Don't force the mind to leave. It's best if you allow the mind to leave when it's ready. But meanwhile, you do lots of prayers and practices to help the person. You know? And so the difficult one is the organs one. And this is something, when I was working on this book, I had no idea what they actually did, you know. And I know all the lamas, every lama you ever talk to, they praise the whole business of giving organs, you know. They think it's so amazing that a person has such compassion, they want to give their body to somebody when they die. They say it's so special. And they say to die with that kind of compassion is a perfect way to die. But then when I told Lama Zopa, which I only learned about while I was doing that book, that actually they don't wait till your mind leaves the body, obviously. They just, as soon as you stop breathing, they keep you breathing. They keep your heart beating. They keep you all warm and toasty, which means your mind is there. As Lama Zopa says, if the person can breathe, even artificially, if the heart can beat, if the blood is racing around the body, that's the proof that mind is there, the way Buddhism describes mind. It's not possible to keep an actual dead body breathing. It's insane. It's a demented idea for the Buddhists, you know. So it's quite difficult. He said they need to have these discussions. So what happens is, as you must know, they keep the body breathing, and then they take it to the you know, operating theatre, and then they get the circular saw and they cut it open and they cut out the organs. Well, there's this particular story. It's very interesting. In a book I read while I was editing this book by an American medical journalist, it's a very funny fellow. He called it The Undead. And it was all about the different difficulties and problems and contradictions in the American medical system now in all the different states. People are now very confused about when death is, because they're having all these experiences of people coming back to life. All cultures, since God knows when, report people coming back to life. But in our materialist culture, we just put it on the too hard basket because we just don't know how to explain it. But it's a real problem when it comes to taking people's organs, because you think they're dead, you're ready to pull their liver out, and they bloody well wake up again, you know. So it's really confusing to people. They don't know how to deal with this. So there's lots of contradictions and problems, it seems. It was a very interesting book. But he did report one experience of this one woman who offered her organs, and she's on the operating table. And remember, the Buddhist view is her subtle mind is still there. Her subtle mind is there, and that's the mind that dreams. And that's the mind that when people report having out-of-body experiences, he had a whole chapter on people who reported observing their operation. The doctors don't believe it, but he had one woman who had to have such a radical procedure that they had to virtually make her dead in their terms because, you know, but she reported the most vivid experience of watching everything they were doing, all the music they played, all the conversations they had. She was observing all of it. They don't know what to do with this information. It's just not possible because as far as they're concerned, she really was dead, virtually. It was impossible. But this is the point. That's your subtle mind. That's your subtle mind. So that can easily happen. So this woman, I think is what happened. This woman who was, you know, kept alive while they took her organs. So the nurse monitoring the heartbeat said the moment they got the circular saw ready to cut her from head to toe, the nurse observed that the heart went from 100 to 200 beats a minute. And the author joked and said, I wonder what a dead person has to be anxious about. But the reality is, it's not impossible that she had an out-of-body experience, as they call it. You don't actually leave your body, but your subtle mind is conscious. Many people report this. People have that in their dreams. I had one experience one time of being fast asleep, but I was vividly conscious of everything around me. So that's possible. So she obviously, she knows she's still alive. She's observing the doctors doing this operation. She's still her. She's observing them getting the circular saw to cut her, and she has a panic attack. Of course, she'd have a panic attack. Why would your heart go up to 200 beats a minute? You're having a panic attack because you realize you're not dead yet. Don't they know I'm not dead yet? And they're going to cut me open. I mean, can you imagine then dying like that? A virtuous seed would have been triggered before she stopped breathing, but then she freaked out, and the mind freaking out can trigger a negative seed and can reverse the process. And she could have gone to the lower realms. So it's a difficult topic to think about it. So you got to think about it. And and he was very cynical about the business. He said that some of the doctors are the elitist, they're arrogant, they manipulate the rules and the laws, you know, and even in Europe, I've heard now in many countries, it is the law. They've got the law to change that your organs are given automatically unless you say otherwise. It's really quite heavy. I mean, it sounds terrible to me, you know. So meanwhile, it doesn't mean you shouldn't give your organs. Most people don't notice what's happening. Most people will have a peaceful death. It's okay. But it's just a tricky one, which they said that, you know, they need to talk about it. Be careful. The hospitals need to be careful. What else to talk about? So there's all these practices to do as well after the mind has left the body. And there are ways of checking if the mind has left the body. So a typical way to check is if you whether it's your dog or your loved one, if you put your hand in the center of their chest, just above, don't touch it, it'll be vividly warm because their mind, their very subtle mind is still in the center of the heart chakra there, and it will still be warm. If it's frozen cold like the rest of the body, that means the mind has left, you know. So it's best not to, you know, especially, I mean, yeah, anyway, it's best to make sure the mind has gone before you disturb the body, before you bury the body or burn the body and things like that. And it can be very distressing because I know, like the Jewish people, they have to burn the body as quickly as possible. And it's not unlikely the mind is still in the body when you burn them, which can be a very distressing way to die. It's like having your body cut with a circular saw. It'd be awful. So it's an interesting topic. So now let's look at half an hour. So ask me some questions now. Come on, before my voice runs out completely. Yes, Mary Jo. Yes, sweetheart. Darling, you have to unmute Mary Jo. I'm so sorry, darling. I can't hear you. Unmute. There we go. Now I've got you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, darling.
So when you were talking about feeling that heart energy, did you say you do not touch the body?
All I'm saying is if it's your dog or whoever it is, and you want to make sure the mind has left the body, if you put your hand, you don't need to touch the body, but you put your hand just above the heart chakra in the center there.
Yes. Okay.
It'll feel vividly warm, very close. You'll feel the warmth. The rest of the body is quite cold, so it'll be quite a distinct difference. Yes, Mary Jo.
Thank you. I just wanted to be sure I understood that.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, Sarah.
Yes, I have another question. Probably the most probable thing that will happen to us is we will die in a hospital. So is the procedure simplified? We ask that our body be gently placed in the morgue for 3 days. Our friends, relatives, in the meantime, during those 3 days, we'll be doing practices.
Oh.
After the 3 days, we can go to the lab and they can take our organs.
Yeah, they can feed you. They can feed you to the no. But the point is, Sarah, if you're going to give your organs, they will not let that happen. They have to have you warm and toasty. That's the problem. If you want to give your
Really?
organs, there's no way in the world they're going to let you stay in the fridge for 3 days. You've got to be warm and toasty. That's the point. So that's where the contradiction is. So you've either got to decide you will give your organs or you won't, is my feeling.
So if we give our organs, chances are our mind will still, the subtle mind will
Yes,
still
it'll
be in the
it's
body.
it's absolutely not surprising. It'll still be in the body. That's right.
And that could trigger
It could be a
a
problem.
bad.
Now that could be a problem. This is the point. That woman was probably an exception. I bet. I mean, when there was this whole chapter he had of people on the operating table, ordinary alive people, their reports of seeing what was going on. Now I had an operation recently, and I don't notice anything. So most people who are dead, who are on the operating table, won't notice it. So they will be fine. So it will be mostly okay, but they're the circumstances in which it won't be okay because it'll disturb her mind. There are practices you can do later to try and reverse it, but that's just not cool. It's difficult to disturb the mind of the person. But as Lama Zopa says, even if they do cut your organs out and you're not conscious and everything's fine, even then, he said, it's still worth checking to see if the mind has left by putting your hand here, because it's even possible, he said, depending on the operation, depending on what organs they cut out, it's still possible your mind can still stay in the body undisturbed. But these are the things that are the tricky part. You just don't know. It's just playing with fire a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah. What else, people?
Venerable Robina,
Yes, darling, talk to me.
is there a benefit to being cremated over being buried?
None at all. I mean, no. The Tibetan tradition is mostly you cremate. That's very typical Indian and Tibetan. You cremate. No, there's no difference.
And then the second part to that is if you have a relative who wants to keep your ashes, does that in any way affect the person who is?
Okay. Thank you. It's a really good point, darling. But then we haven't, the last part I have to talk about is all the practices you do after the person has been, after the mind has left the body and you've had the funeral. So the thing is, after the person's left, the mind is gone and you're certain about that, and then you can do the funeral. There's lots of things you can even do before that. I mean, Lama Zopa quoted one of his lamas, Kirti Sencho Rinpoche, up in Kham, in Amdo or somewhere in Tibet. What they would do is they'd wrap the body in long rolls of mantras, blessing the body, and they'd burn the body like that, or they wouldn't bury mostly. They'd burn. So then, but then you'd get the ashes. But if you're going to bury the body, you make sure you keep back some nails or some hair. And then those ashes, a little bit of ashes, and there's a really important practice, Rinpoche says is so important. So if you've got your loved one's ashes sitting on your mantelpiece, you should do this practice. You should talk to Geshe Sherab and work out what has to happen. But you've got this special practice where you bless the remains. It's called Jangwa. It takes several hours to do it, and probably Geshe must do it a couple of times a year. It's really important you all communicate with each other, and anybody who's got ashes left over from your dog or your loved one from years ago even, it's so beneficial to have them blessed in this particular practice called Jangwa, where the energy of the Buddhas is invoked, and it literally the relics, the ashes and the body become like relics. And then what you can do, even more beneficial, is you can mix those ashes with plaster and you can make stupas or statues or little tsatsa images. And that's a marvelous thing to do. So then Rinpoche said, that's such a blessing for the person who died, and it's a blessing for you. But just to go to the go to the cemetery and put flowers on the coffin where your dead body of your loved one is, he said, that's not benefit to them or you. But if you bless the ashes or bless the remains, and that's really so special, such powerful practice and such powerful purification. It's one of the practices he really recommends, and it's in the book, of course. It's not the practice itself, it's not, it's quite long, but Geshe Sherab would surely do that, or you can organize it between you, to have it done at a monastery somewhere. That's so important. Do you understand? I remember one of my friends in Australia, her son died. He was like 40 and had a young wife, young children. And of course, it was just devastating, this young man died. And the ashes were sitting on the mantelpiece for weeks because the wife didn't know what to do with it, just was so brokenhearted about her husband. And so I said to the mother, because they knew she was Buddhist, get the ashes, get them blessed, and mix them up and make them these little lovely little images of the Buddhas, like the thing that, they're called tsatsas. Have you seen those?
Yes.
Yeah, and so then people, and you give it to the children, give it to the wife, and it's this beautiful holy image, and that's your beloved. It's much more beautiful than having ashes in a canister, you know, and it's blessed, and people are happy with that. They like that idea, unless of course they're Christians, they mightn't like it. But it's a very moving and very powerful blessing and purification for the person who's died.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. And there's many of these practices you can do that are beneficial for the person. Like you have pujas and prayers, you make sure you give away all their things, you make sure that, you know, like you offer money to sponsor the publishing of books in their name, you make stupas. There's so many ways you can bless and benefit the person who's died, which can help their karma as well, you understand? And that's all in the book. They're all in the book. You know. What else, people? Nothing. Oh. Well, we're finished. I'm surprised. Hour and a half. It's gone. It took 4 days to do it in Sechen Ling. Took the Domi Ling. What else? What else, people? No
Hello,
questions?
Venerable Robina. Oh,
Who's
sorry.
payment? Go.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Talk to me. Who's talking?
This is Dawn.
Hello, Dawn. Good, darling. Talk to me.
Okay, so my question is, like with my stepmom, she died a few years ago, and I was very fortunate to be with her for some days before and then during. So back to like the karma of the relationships in our lives, like as she has transitioned, do her and my karma, like based on the relationship that we had in this lifetime, like is it possible to then in the next lifetimes be with this person karmically? Or
Sweetheart, the only reason you meet anybody is because you've met them before. So of course you're going to bump into each other again, but it might turn, she might become your dog or your boyfriend, so you can't recognize.
right,
Or she might become your enemy, because we've got lots of karmic relationships in many different lifetimes. And you know yourself, in one lifetime, you could have your beloved for the first year and then your worst enemy for the second. So you've got these different karmic connections with different people. So in particular life, one was, you know, a person you adore. But next life, who knows who they'll be? Of course you've got karma. You only meet people you've got a karmic connection with, darling. It's not possible otherwise. It's the karmic connection. It's the history we create with each other that causes us to meet again. And it is the main cause of the quality of that relationship.
so if I have a loving relationship with my stepmom,
Then it's like when you meet again, it'll be very virtuous, and as long as there's not much attachment. Yeah.
and then if I had a
But you also might have other lives from 57 lives ago when you were the worst enemy. You don't know which one's going to ripen,
okay,
because we've got all of them. We've been enemies and friends with everybody at some point or other. But of course, it's the history that we have with each other that is what causes the relationship we have now. So you could argue the way you had a loving relationship with her, that was the fruit of your past virtue, collective virtue from the past. But if you continued that, then it's likely, again, yes, it'll continue. That's the whole point. That's why we have to fix our relationships up now before we die. Our side, our part of it anyway. Then you'll make sure it's virtuous next time. Absolutely. Do you understand?
yes. And then I was gonna say also, my late husband, he, you know, after he passed, I had many dreams with him. I didn't really see that it was like us connecting, like, but it was like us, it was me working out with him through my dreams, things that were unfinished at the time of his death, like issues that we were working on in our friendship and our relationship. So I saw those dreams more as like a,
That's your mind working your stuff out.
right. It wasn't like,
He wasn't there most likely. No, you just, you know, what we see at our dreams is just karmic appearances of our own stuff. It's possible to actually see beings in dreams sometimes, but mostly the people who appear in our dreams are just coming from our own mind. So you were just sorting out your own stuff, weren't you?
yes, that's what it felt like. Now, I distinctly, though, I had a dream 3 weeks before he died, where he died in the dream, and
So
it felt so real. You
that's
know,
got Okay, what happens is why we see things in dreams is because our dream mind is more subtle. And it's that level of mind that can have clairvoyant experiences. The subtle mind is unobscured by the grosser level of conceptuality in the senses. So it's more subtle, more powerful. That's why people often have clairvoyant experiences in their dreams. See the past, see the future. That's not uncommon. That's your subtle mind. And our subtle mind is capable of that because it's less gross.
Yeah, in that dream, I was holding his head and telling him that everyone loved him. You know,
But that's
me,
you. That's not him. That's you. It's all
like,
about you.
like,
That's about you.
mhm.
That's about you. Okay, you're talking about you here. That's fine.
And it felt real that he was going to die.
Okay, that's right.
In that dream.
You said that. You told me that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It can happen in dreams. Yeah.
Anyways, just that's fascinating. That's all.
Yeah, it's true. It is,
Thank-
darling. Any other questions?
No.
No more for you. Okay, anybody else got any questions? Yes, Sarah.
No.
No questions.
I-
Okay.
Well, yes, I do have a question.
What, darling? What?
We can buy the Liberation box, I believe, from the
Still around?
FPMT.
I think it's still around. Yeah, Rinpoche's put together a few things in that box, like a blessing string, blessed pills, a stupa, a little card with mantras on it. These are all the things that he talks about in his book that are helpful to use for your loved one, or for ourselves. Yes.
So we should have that on hand.
That'd be useful. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, darling. This book of Rinpoche's is indispensable as your handbook. That's the
Okay.
best thing you have is this book, paperback, or you can get it in a PDF. Now, I think they haven't done I think the PDF is done. I think the ebook is done. I think so. I can't remember. I'll check up. What else, people?
I have kind of it's a question because I have that Liberation box and I've used it so
Good.
many times.
That's very
And
fascinating.
I ran out of the pills.
Yeah, of course you did. That's right.
I can't, I don't know how to get more of those. Do you know anything
You
about
have to
that?
contact Tom Trudy at the international office.
Oh, Tom, okay.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. What else, darling? People, questions. There have to be more questions. Don't be afraid. More questions. I mean, we're going to die. We're going to be ready for it. No questions. All right. Well, I mean, I've gone through most things, just touched upon it. You know, no, maybe I'll talk about something else. Okay, I'll talk about the Pure Lands. As you're going to notice in this book, Rinpoche repeatedly talks about so you can get a perfect human rebirth or be born in the Pure Lands. So what in earth is a Pure Land? I will tell you, okay? So now, okay, what a Buddha is the word we use to refer to the actual Buddha is the unmanifest, all-knowing, all-compassionate, all-wise, all-pervasive, unmanifest consciousness. It's like how they talk about God. God is everywhere. God pervades the universe. That's exactly what Buddha means. It's the fully enlightened mind, no longer delusions, all the delusions gone, full of wisdom, full of compassion. And because mind is not physical, think about this. Our mind is not physical, but for us, it's conjoined with this bag of bones. And we live at a very gross level of our mind because we're not very capable. So our mind is very limited right now because we're completely connected to this walking sewer, basically. But as you progress, lessening your delusions and growing your virtues, you literally give up attachment to delusions and literally you expand your consciousness. And as you become a bodhisattva, you already at the lowest level of being a bodhisattva, you are capable of manifesting your mind in at least 100 different bodies all over the world simultaneously. You become more and more powerful. So that's the manifestation of the Buddha mind. So that's a bodhisattva. But the actual mind itself, as you maybe know the word, the Dharmakaya, Sanskrit, is referring to the unmanifest, all-knowing, all-compassionate Buddha mind that pervades wherever there is existence. So if you think about it, if the mind is not physical, how can it be confined by space or time or matter? And once it's enlightened, of course, it can't be. So it's quite literally, as I used to love it as a child when I was a Catholic, God is everywhere. I try to imagine that, you know. Well, that's exactly the meaning of Buddha. That's why I think over the centuries, the Christians and the Muslims and all the great the great yogis have seen many similar things, but they just interpret them differently, you know. So it's a similar idea as a concept of God, like I said, but except it's called Buddha, and everybody can become one. So when you become one of those, and I become one of those, and Sarah becomes one of those, we don't bump into each other in the sky. You've got one of those. There's one Dharmakaya. But then, now that's the actual Buddha. But what good is that to peanuts like you and me? The reason a person has become a Buddha is out of compassion to help us. Well, we can't communicate with subtle mind, so they manifest in bodies to help us. This is the point now. So they manifest in two kinds of bodies. The regular body that you and I can see is like Shakyamuni Buddha, the monk of 2,500 years ago. That's called the emanation body. So if the Dalai Lama is a Buddha, they say he is, let's say he is a Buddha. What we see is a nice Tibetan man, don't we? We don't see a Buddha. You can't see a Buddha because Buddha is a mind. But they take a shape and a form that's suitable to sentient beings. You can't see he's the Buddha. If you were living in India 2,500 years ago, the place was crawling with sadhus. You couldn't tell one sadhu from another. You wouldn't have known Buddha from anybody else. We just see nice statues of him. We go, oh, there's Buddha, but you couldn't tell back then because a Buddha doesn't need a body. So that's why that's what a teacher means. You got to check up on their qualities. That's the relative Buddha, and that's known as the Nirmanakaya, the emanation body. So that's an ordinary person looking like you and me, who act like you and me, and live in a house like you and me, and do things like you and me. But there's a subtler body in which the Buddha manifests that only the great bodhisattvas who realized emptiness can actually cognize in their meditation, and that's the subtle light body, and that's depicted by all those thousands of Buddhas. Tara and Chenrezig in Vadriana. There's all these different shapes and colors and sizes of male and female Buddhas, all manifestations in this subtle light form, the enjoyment body, the Sambhogakaya, that is the form that is more subtle. And then they also have an environment they live in. We all live in environments. We don't float in the sky, do we? So this Sambhogakaya, this enjoyment body, they have their own environment, and that's what a Pure Land is. So you see all those circular drawings, we call them mandalas. All that is an architectural drawing of the abode of one of the Buddhas. But it's a subtle, when you do those sadhanas and you visualize all the subtle this and the mansion and that, that's the subtle home of the Buddha at that subtle level. We're talking real stuff here, not fantasy. So that's a Pure Land. And all the Buddhas have their own Pure Land. Well, Lama Zopa has a chapter in the book. Most Pure Lands are not available to most of us until you've realized emptiness, until you've got high realizations, except Amitabha's Pure Land, apparently. So Rinpoche also goes on about Amitabha's Pure Land. Because ordinary people like you and me who are still deluded can have the karma to go to Amitabha's Pure Land. So Pure Land means you'd also have a subtle light body. You don't have a bag of bones. You have to go to the toilet and eat food and everything like that. You don't have to do any of that because your subtle physical energy manifests as subtle light. So you're in this blissful environment where everything is the Dharma, everything is the Buddha, it's 24 hours a day. So the only reason to go to Amitabha's Pure Land is so you can get enlightened quickly and then come back to the human realm and help people. So Rinpoche goes on and on about all the time to pray, to want to go to Amitabha's Pure Land. So since reading this book and editing it, I'm now a fan of going to Amitabha's Pure Land. So when I go to sleep, I turn on my iPad and I'm reciting on my iPad in my voice the prayer by Tsongkhapa of going to Amitabha's Pure Land. Then I alternate with the King of Prayers. So both of those prayers, they say guaranteed if you do those every day, you'll go straight to a Pure Land when you die. So that's my plan now. I've decided. I've booked an aeroplane to Amitabha's Pure Land. If I miss that, I'll get a human one. And if I miss that, I'm in big trouble. Because what I also realized doing this book, we all know we like karma. We're Buddhists. Oh, yeah, karma, blah, blah, blah. But we all cross our fingers, a bit like when we were Christians, and hope that Lama Zopa sees we're a good girl and he'll take care of me. That's ridiculous. You're your own boss. So you've got to decide where you want to get born. You got to make it. And then once you decide where you're going to get born, like I've got to decide I'm going to go to Taos. But I don't just go there, oh, may I go to Taos? I've got to get a car and get the way to get there. Well, the same with Pure Land. I've got to want to go there first, but then I've got to work out what are the causes. Well, really good morality, keeping my vows and doing lots of practices and wanting to go there and thinking about it. That's one of the main causes. And the only reason to go is to get enlightened quickly. So then you can help others. So I'm a fan now. I'm going to go to Amitabha's Pure Land. That's my plan. Okay, you people. See you there.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you just quickly, before I ask the question, well, it's in the book. I'll look it in the book.
Never mind, just ask one. Good for everybody.
Well, you were saying if you do Tsongkhapa's, what is it, a prayer? It's Tsongkhapa's
Yeah, there's two
prayer.
things in there. One is a description of the Pure Land, and then another one is a prayer to go there, and like an aspiration. It's quite like 10 minutes. It takes about 10 minutes to recite it. It's in the book.
Okay. Okay.
Good.
And so Amitabha is the Nirmanakaya. Is the Pure Land, are the ones that go to the Pure Land, they're Nirmanakaya, or are they Sambhogakaya?
I mean, Amitabha is a Sambhogakaya form of Amitabha. So
Okay, so Amitabha.
They use their names interchangeably. Yeah. So it seems like the Nirmanakaya, I mean, I don't understand properly because, Amitabha, there are the five, what we call the five Dhyani Buddhas, the five Buddha families. And they all look like they're in the aspect of the Nirmanakaya, which is the same as Shakyamuni Buddha. And then all the Buddhas in Tantra are underneath them in those families. They're all connected to those. But it seems like Amitabha is this Sambhogakaya aspect of Amitabha. Each of the Buddhas has both aspects.
Yeah, that's confusing to me. So the Sambhogakaya are beautiful with all the the necklaces.
That's right, the tantric aspect. The Nirmanakaya is the monk aspect. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
I want to go there too.
Good. I'll see you there.
Me too. Me too.
Good. We'll go we'll do a group booking.
Yes.
We get a good deal.
Get a good deal. Yeah. What else, you people? It's into. Anything else we've missed? I mean, there's so much we've missed. Yes, Sarah. Good, darling. Talk to me.
This is rolling it back to the beginning of your lecture.
Yes.
You mentioned that we do purification practices. Could you review those again? Which practices are those?
I will, definitely. The very first level of practice, like junior school, entry level, grade 1, the essence of the first scope of practice, the first scope, or I like to call it junior school, is abide by the laws of karma. This is all about controlling our body and speech for our benefit so that we don't create negative karma and don't create suffering in the future. So the very first level of practice is just, Lama Zopa says, the most immediate urgent level of practice is to stop killing, stop lying, stop stealing, stop harming sentient beings, because harming sentient beings are the heaviest of the negative actions. Do you understand? So that's the first level of practice. But then your next level, you've got to take care of all the seeds you've already planted in countless past lives and put atomic bombs under them before they ripen as your suffering. That's purification, Sarah. And that's the four opponent powers. This, Lama Zopa says, we are insane. We'll go through it now. We have 6 minutes left, 7 minutes. We are insane, he says, not to do this practice every day. So it consists, and that's what you should end the day with. So you live in your vows every day, not killing, not stealing, not lying. You try to control yourself, and then you do the purification. And it's so powerful because you regret the rubbish you've done because you're sick of suffering. It's like compassion for yourself. Then you rely upon the Buddha as your doctor, whose methods you want to use, because you don't get healed by somebody else. You do the healing. And that's the major difference between the Christian teaching. If I rely upon God, a sin in Christianity is a really important point. A sin in Christianity is doing what God said not to do. A negative action in Buddhism is harming others. It's a natural law. There's no equivalent in Buddhism of God's law. But we're very familiar with that idea. So naturally, if I go against God's will, I have to regret my action to God. And then what purifies me is God's forgiveness. This is a massive point in Christianity. And I think that comes down into our lives. We feel I'm a bad person until someone else forgives me. Buddha says that's ridiculous. You've got to forgive yourself. So the Buddha's view is you've got to purify your own mind. So thinking that, someone's forgiveness will purify you is a bit like going to your doctor and you ask her to forgive you for smoking, then her forgiveness purifies the cancer. That's just absurd for the Buddha. It's good to be forgiven, but it's not what cleans us up. We have to do our own purification. So the first step is you've got to acknowledge you did the dumb things and you're sick of suffering. The second one is you rely upon the Buddha, whose medicine you really want. So that's the reliance part. But he's the doctor. The doctor gives you the medicine, but you take the medicine. You do the purification. And then in that second step, you also have compassion for those you've harmed. The third one, you take the medicine. So the best medicine, all the lamas say, is this visualization of the particular Buddha called Vajrasattva. And you visualize purifying while you recite his mantra. It's said to be the most potent medicine, the third step. And the fourth step, as Paponka Rinpoche says, is the most important. It's reliance. So it's the 4 R's: regret, rely, reliance, the remedy, and resolve. And the fourth one is, are you determined not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to badmouth your boyfriend or whatever? You make a determination to change. This is how there's no karma we can't purify. This is such a powerful practice psychologically to end the day with. It's so beneficial, I tell you.
This is the little yellow book.
That's a little tiny version of it, but there are
Yeah.
it's good to have a longer version with more explanation, because the 4 steps are most important. And I've got a feeling maybe in this PDF that I'll send you, I've got a teaching in there by me about how we create karma. I will add to it a teaching about the purification practice and how we purify it. Sarah, I'll send that as well. I'll do that. I won't do it tonight, John. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll change the PDF to add some extra teachings into it for people. It's all in there, and the practice itself will be there as well, Sarah.
Thank you.
Good, darling. Anybody else? Time to go.
This is Don. Hi, Venerable Robina. Just one technical question with like the information that I received in the email about purification practice in the evening. Do we do the refuge prayer 3 times at the beginning of
The 4 steps in the purification practice? The refuge is in the second step. You rely upon the Buddha. That's why you would take refuge 3 times.
Okay.
It's in the practice.
With
But I'm
the-
going to send it again in this practice. Notes I'm going to send tonight. But the refuge, the reliance step, which is the second one, sometimes it's given in a different order, but in this one that I'm sending you, it's the second one. The first one is you sit there and you talk to yourself, basically, acknowledging, I did this, I did that, I badmouthed my boyfriend, I killed a dog, I had an abortion 22 years ago, and then you regret those actions you've done because I don't want the future suffering. That's the point about regret. And then you regret anything you've done in past lives because I don't want the future suffering. That's like compassion for yourself. The next one is, well, whom can I turn to? That's refuge. You rely upon the Buddha. It's there that you'd visualize Buddha above your head, and it's there you do the refuge prayer. And then the second part of reliance is now where you have compassion for those you've harmed. And the third step is you do the remedy. You'd visualize and recite the mantra. And the fourth is the resolve to change. Okay. All right. Time to go. All right.
And Robina, I have a quick question. This is Victor.
Yes, Victor. Talk to me.
In Western culture, they like to scatter ashes of loved ones. Is there anything benefit about that in Tibet?
That's a really good point. Thank you, Victor. I didn't finish. In the section on getting the ashes blessed with the Jangwa practice, you can either make tsatsas or stupas, or you can spread the ashes. You can throw it into the wind, or you can throw it into the water. And Lama Zopa says, because the ashes are now blessed, it benefits all the creatures who touch it. So yes, you can do that, but you bless it first. Thank you, Victor. I forgot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good, good. Yeah, absolutely. That's it, I think, people. We're finished. Okay.
Thank you.
So we think this 2 hours gone like a dream. All these thoughts we've had, all these seeds we've planted, any information here that's useful to us, get Lama Zopa's book. I really encourage you, and even study it between you to do together. Have a course every now and again on it, and talk about who's got ashes, and see if you can organize with Geshe Sherab, or he can organize it with somebody to bless the ashes, so you can then make tsatsas and stupas. It's a really nice community thing to do. It's very auspicious. You can learn to do tsatsas together. It's so nice to do this. It's so important. It uplifts people. And it's good for your loved one. So good for your little doggy or your husband to bless their ashes. So we think all we've learned from this to do all these things, so we can live our lives well, so we can die peacefully, so we can die virtuously, so we can get a decent human body or go to Amitabha's Pure Land and keep on practicing until we become Buddha, so we can benefit sentient beings. That'll do. I can't sing. That's enough. The words are good enough. That's our dedication.
Can I do specific names that I have on a list here for dedication?
Wonderful, yeah.
Okay, so we dedicate for those who've recently died in conflict, natural disasters, accidental death, starvation, suicide, homicide. including Evan Levy, Rayleigh, Kristen Riley, Bodie the Husky, all those who have died from COVID at the Living Center, Cass's mother, Spike the Kitty, Deborah and James Daring, Donkey, Bull, Alan Ayres, Klaus. Also those who are dealing with illness or injury, Sarah Hanlon, Lyra Laurie, Rudabeh Alam, Auntie Naz Alam, Nate Steinberg, Jenny, Peter, Nora, Andrew Hay, Amanda Larimore, Mary Coleman, Shelley Longanecker, Jana Bailey, Dean Archuleta, Greg Freelove, Amina, Lila, and Dennis. And those dealing with obstacles, Maggie, Sue, Sarah Jacobson, Gray Leger, Nate Steinberg, Abby, Nora, Inira O'Shea, Harvey King, Christy, Eden, Harmony, Serena, Taddy McAllister, Jessie Hay and her children, nurses at Las Vegas Hospital, Lyra Laurie, Dean Archuleta, nurses and administration at Alta Vista Hospital, and Linda.
Good, okay. Jang Chup Sem Chogun Poche Ma Ke Panam Ke Guchi. Ke Panyam Pa Me Payan Gong Ne Gong Du Baba Shog. Maybe just say a few medicine Buddha mantras. Imagine medicine Buddha in the sky, pouring out light and blessings onto all those people and to everybody in the universe as well as ourselves. Taya Taum Bekanze Maha Bekanze Ranza Samun Gate Swaha. Taya Taum Bekanze Maha Bekanze Ranza Samun Gate Swaha. Taya Taum Bekanze Maha Bekanze Ranza Samun Gate Swaha. Taya Taum Bekanze Maha Bekanze Ranza Samun Gate Swaha. Okay. Thank you, darling.